What about in the case of when a dryer seems like it's always getting too hot?
So there's kind of two different things that it may be that I would get clarification. Does it seem like the clothes are getting too hot, or does it seem like the outside of the dryer is getting too hot? The lower quality, the lower price of the dryer, it's not built as well. So as far as like the heat distribution, the airflow, everything isn't going to be as good. So those are going to typically get hotter on the outside, which is normal. Now if it could, start to discolor the floor or the wall, that's going to be too hot. But, most of the time when they say that, it means that the inside clothes are getting too hot. The dryers that have the lint trap that comes from the very top without opening the door, those are built like how dryers were built 20 plus years ago. So the variance in temperature on those could reach as hot as, I've seen them get close to 280 degrees before they cycle down to cool. So if it's one of those, it's normal for it to get hot even on a low setting. The low setting on that type of dryer is nearly the high setting on a more high efficient dryer. But, on average, the reason your clothes get too hot is because of poor ventilation. So the average dryer, let's just say high, because most people dry their clothes on a high heat. Just like an oven, the heating element works by cycling in temperature. So if you have it set on high, it's going to know that, okay, we're going to turn on the heating element. It's going to heat up until it gets around 225 degrees. And then once we detect that, we're going to shut power off. We're going to let it cool till it gets somewhere between 160 and 180 degrees before we turn it back on. And so it keeps cycling like that, just like an oven. So where it reads that temperature is that thermistor on the blower housing. So when you have restricted airflow, you don't have that airflow going through the blower housing for the thermistor to read it. So what it's reading is, oh, hey, the dryer's only 180 degrees right now because there's no airflow going through it. But in actuality, it may be upwards of nearly 300 degrees inside the dryer, but that thermistor isn't able to read it. So you're going to have your clothes getting extremely hot. And so that is usually the reason for the clothes getting too hot, is because of a ventilation issue. Still recommend the same thing. Try running a load with the vent disconnected from the wall. If it still seems like it's getting too hot, even though you have it set on low, then at that point you would want to replace your thermistor. That would be the main thing. The other thing that can happen when it gets too hot, so I talked about the heating element cycling on and off. The way that a heating element gets power is it has two terminals. So one side of the heating element gets power from either the control board or from the timer, whichever one it has. So it goes from the control board. It may go through a fuse or two before it reaches a heating element. The other side of the heating element is powered by the electricity that actually goes through a switch on the motor. They call it a centrifugal switch. So you'll notice when you start a dryer, you hit start, you'll hear it start, and then about 2 seconds later you'll hear it click. So that is the centrifugal switch. Once the motor reaches a certain RPM, it activates a switch which lets it power through to the other side of the heating element. This is a safety feature, so if your motor isn't turning because the motor's bad, because the belt's broken, when you turn your dryer on, it will not turn the heating element on because the motor isn't moving to activate the switch to give it the rest of the power. It's kind of a neat safety feature built in. The reason that I went into all that was because if it is getting too hot, what can happen is when the heating elements go bad sometimes, because they're just essentially kind of a wire wrapped around and around, is instead of just kind of breaking, they'll pop and they'll touch the frame housing of the heating element housing. So as the drum's turning, we're always getting that one side of power. But because the other side of power turns on and off as it heats up and cools down, when there's no power supply to the other side, it won't heat. What happens when your heating element goes bad and part of it touches the frame is you're always getting power on one side when the motor's turning. So what does it do is it goes through the heating element, then it grounds itself on the element housing. So essentially your heating element never turns off the whole time it's spinning. And so it'll slowly just increase and increase and increase in temperature, and those clothes will get super duper hot. So you would want to get a new heating element if that's the case. It's really easy to check a heating element with a meter. You basically go on either side to each terminal and you check the resistance. and it's going to be anywhere between, anything above 6 ohms to 18 or so ohms is fine. But the other thing you want to check is you want to set your meter to what they call continuity. That's like if you check a fuse and it beeps at you. You put one end of the meter on the frame of the heating element housing, and then you touch each terminal of the heating element. And if it beeps, that means the element is touching the housing. That's why it's getting too hot and you need a new heating element.